The annual summer fete at St. Catherine's Vicarage in the village of Little Wickham was proceeding with the sort of gentle, predictable charm that made English village life both comforting and, to the discerning observer, faintly dangerous in its very ordinariness. The afternoon sun cast dappled shadows through the ancient oak trees, while bunting fluttered lazily between the stalls that dotted the vicarage lawn like colourful islands in a sea of emerald grass. Miss Jane Marple sat in her customary position beneath a spreading chestnut tree, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on what appeared to be a particularly intricate baby shawl. To the casual observer, she seemed entirely absorbed in her handiwork, but those pale blue eyes missed nothing of the human drama unfolding around her. She had learned long ago that people revealed their truest selves when they believed no one of importance was watching, and a church fete provided the perfect stage for such revelations. Her attention was particularly drawn to the centerpiece of this year's charitable efforts, Miss Agnes Thornfield's magnificent sewing basket, which sat in pride of place at the handicrafts stall. The basket itself was a work of art, an antique wicker creation with a domed lid and worn leather handles, its interior lined with faded rose-sprigged chintz that spoke of decades of careful use. It had belonged to Agnes's late aunt, Miss Cordelia Thornfield, who had been something of a legend in Little Wickham for her needlework and, if village gossip was to be believed, her rather more scandalous romantic entanglements in her youth. Agnes herself stood behind the stall, a thin, nervous woman in her early 50s whose pale brown hair was pulled back in an unforgiving bun. She wore a sensible grey dress that had seen better days, and her hands, Miss Marple noticed, trembled slightly as she arranged and rearranged the items for sale. There was something almost desperate in the way she kept glancing toward the sewing basket, as if she feared it might somehow escape her vigilance. "Such beautiful work," commented Mrs. Dolly Bantry, Miss Marple's old friend, who had insisted on dragging her to Little Wickham for the weekend. Dolly was examining a delicate lace collar with the enthusiasm of someone who appreciated fine craftsmanship. "That basket must have seen some history, I should think." Agnes Thornfield's hands stilled for a moment. "Yes," she said quietly. "Aunt Cordelia used it all her life. She kept everything in it. Threads, patterns, letters." Her voice trailed off, and she seemed to realize she had said more than she intended. Miss Marple's needles paused almost imperceptibly. Letters. How curious that Agnes should mention letters in connection with a sewing basket that was about to be raffled off to strangers. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Geoffrey Hartwell, the village's newest resident and, by all accounts, a man of considerable wealth and equally considerable mystery. He had purchased Thornfield Manor, the very house where Agnes's aunt had lived until her death 6 months prior, and had been making what the locals considered unseemly haste in modernizing the property. He was a tall, distinguished man in his early 60s, with silver hair and the sort of confident bearing that suggested he was accustomed to getting his own way. "Miss Thornfield," he said, his voice carrying easily across the stall, "I trust you've had no second thoughts about our arrangement." Agnes's face went quite white. "No, Mr. Hartwell. Everything is as we discussed." "Excellent. I should hate for there to be any complications." His smile was pleasant enough, but Miss Marple detected a steely undertone that made her look up from her knitting with sharper attention. As Hartwell moved away, Agnes's hands began to shake more violently. She reached for the sewing basket as if to steady herself, then seemed to think better of it and pulled her hands back as if the basket had burned her. Miss Marple was contemplating this interesting exchange when a commotion arose from the direction of the tea tent. Mrs. Celia Pemberton, the vicar's wife and chief organizer of the fete, came hurrying across the lawn with an expression of barely controlled panic. "Agnes, my dear," she called breathlessly, "we have a crisis with the raffle tickets. It seems someone has been tampering with the numbers, and we simply must draw for your aunt's basket immediately before there's any more confusion." The crowd began to gather as Mrs. Pemberton explained the situation in increasingly flustered tones. The raffle for Miss Cordelia's sewing basket had been the anticipated highlight of the afternoon, with tickets selling briskly at £0.50 each. Now, it seemed, several people were claiming to hold winning numbers, and the only solution was to hold an immediate drawing with the vicar himself officiating. As the makeshift ceremony began, Miss Marple noticed several things that struck her as significant. Agnes Thornfield stood rigidly beside her stall, her eyes fixed not on the raffle proceedings but on Geoffrey Hartwell, who watched from the edge of the crowd with an expression of calculated interest. Dr. Marcus Finch, the village physician, kept glancing nervously between Agnes and Hartwell, his usually steady hands fidgeting with his watch chain. Most curious of all was the behavior of Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, Geoffrey's wife, who had positioned herself near the sewing basket and seemed to be studying it with the intensity of someone trying to memorize every detail. The vicar, a kindly but somewhat absent-minded man named Reverend Whitmore, drew the winning ticket with appropriate ceremony. "Number 47, he announced, "Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell." A ripple of surprise went through the crowd. It seemed rather convenient that the winner should be the wife of the man who had purchased the Thornfield estate. Mrs. Hartwell stepped forward with a gracious smile, but Miss Marple noticed that her hands were trembling as she accepted the basket from Agnes. "How lovely," Mrs. Hartwell said, her voice slightly strained. "I shall treasure it always." Agnes Thornfield said nothing, but her face had gone from white to grey, and she swayed slightly on her feet. Dr. Finch moved quickly to her side, his professional instincts overriding whatever personal concerns had been troubling him. "Perhaps you should sit down, Miss Thornfield," he suggested gently. "The excitement of the afternoon." But Agnes was staring at the sewing basket in Mrs. Hartwell's arms with an expression of such naked terror that several people in the crowd began to murmur with concern. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then seemed to think better of it and simply shook her head. It was then that Mrs. Hartwell, perhaps nervous under the scrutiny of so many eyes, fumbled with the basket's clasp. The lid sprang open, and several items tumbled out onto the grass: spools of thread, a silver thimble, a packet of needles, and something else that made Agnes Thornfield cry out in dismay. A small, yellowed envelope, sealed with red wax and bearing an inscription in faded ink: "To be opened only upon my death. C. Thornfield." The envelope lay on the grass for a moment, innocent enough in appearance, but somehow radiating an aura of significance that made the assembled villagers fall silent. Mrs. Hartwell bent to retrieve it, but Agnes Thornfield moved with surprising speed, snatching the envelope from the ground and clutching it to her chest. "That's not part of the raffle," she said, her voice high and strained. "That's private. Aunt Cordelia never meant for anyone else to see." "My dear Miss Thornfield," Geoffrey Hartwell's voice cut through the tension like a knife, "I believe you're mistaken. The basket was sold as is, contents and all. Surely any personal items should have been removed beforehand." Agnes looked around desperately, as if seeking support, but found only curious faces and uncomfortable silence. Dr. Finch stepped forward, his expression troubled. "Perhaps this is a matter that could be resolved privately," he suggested. "There's no need to—" His words were cut off by a sharp crack, like the sound of breaking glass. Agnes Thornfield's eyes widened in shock, and she looked down at her chest, where a dark stain was spreading across the grey fabric of her dress. The sealed envelope fluttered from her nerveless fingers as she collapsed to the ground. In the horrified silence that followed, Miss Marple's keen eyes took in every detail. The small, ornate hatpin that protruded from Agnes's chest, the way Geoffrey Hartwell's face had gone perfectly blank, Mrs. Hartwell's strangled gasp of what might have been surprise or recognition, and Dr. Finch's immediate, professional response as he dropped to his knees beside the fallen woman. But most significantly, she noticed how the sealed envelope had fallen open when it hit the ground, revealing not the expected letter, but something far more intriguing: a small brass key and a piece of paper bearing what appeared to be a map of the Thornfield Manor grounds. As the peaceful afternoon dissolved into chaos, and someone ran to telephone for the police, Miss Marple carefully gathered her knitting and reflected that the secret folded inside the sewing basket had indeed been worth killing for. The question now was which of the several people with access to that basket had been desperate enough to commit murder to keep that secret buried. The summer fete at Little Wickham had taken a decidedly deadly turn, and Miss Marple found herself once again in the position of untangling the complex web of human nature, village secrets, and the dangerous consequences of long-buried truths finally coming to light. The scream that pierced the afternoon air came from Mrs. Celia Pemberton, though it seemed quite unnecessary, since everyone could already see that something dreadful had occurred. She clutched the edge of the cake stall, her face draining of color as she whispered, "Oh, my heavens," before sinking onto a wooden chair reserved for elderly parishioners. Dr. Marcus Finch, kneeling beside Agnes Thornfield's still form, worked with the calm efficiency of a man who had seen death in many guises. His fingers checked for a pulse that would not come, then examined the ornate object protruding from her chest. The hatpin was clearly antique. Silver, with an elaborate head set with tiny seed pearls around a cloudy cabochon stone that caught the fading sunlight. "Is she—" Mrs. Bantry began, her voice barely audible. "Quite gone, I'm afraid," Dr. Finch replied tersely. "Please, everyone step back. Nothing must be disturbed until the police arrive." The villagers, who had instinctively surged forward in their shock, now formed a ragged circle around the body. Children were hastily shepherded away by anxious mothers, while the adults remained, bound together by a mixture of horror and that peculiar fascination that sudden death invariably produces in otherwise respectable people. Young Timothy Fletcher came running from the vicarage with news that Constable Davies was on his way, followed shortly by Inspector Craddock from the county seat. This announcement seemed to galvanize the assembled crowd, and Miss Marple watched with interest as various individuals began positioning themselves for what they clearly anticipated would be formal questioning. It was Mrs. Hartwell who broke the stunned silence with a revelation that sent fresh murmurs through the crowd. "I recognize that hatpin," she said, her voice thin and strained. "It belonged to Miss Cordelia Thornfield. She always wore it when receiving callers at the manor." This news struck the gathering like a physical blow. If the murder weapon had belonged to Agnes's aunt, it suggested a level of premeditation that transformed the crime from a moment of passion into something far more calculated and personal. Mrs. Pemberton, recovering from her initial shock, began wringing her hands. Poor Agnes always seemed so secretive, so burdened. One always sensed she carried heavy worries. That aunt of hers, Miss Cordelia, was quite a character. There were always whispers about her past. Geoffrey Hartwell stepped forward with measured composure. "Constable," he addressed the arriving P.C. Davies, "I should explain my connection to Miss Thornfield. We had been conducting business regarding her late aunt's estate. I wouldn't want any misunderstanding about our relationship." His tone was perfectly reasonable, but Miss Marple detected an undercurrent of urgency that suggested Mr. Hartwell was eager to establish his version of events before alternative interpretations could emerge. She also noted how his wife Eleanor still clutched the sewing basket, her knuckles white against the wicker handle. Dr. Finch rose from his examination, dusting off his knees with careful precision. "The wound was inflicted with considerable force," he announced. "The hatpin penetrated directly into the heart. Death would have been almost instantaneous. This was no accident. The angle and depth indicate deliberate action." "She had been under tremendous stress recently," Dr. Finch continued, his professional manner intact despite the circumstances. "I prescribed a mild sedative only last week. Her nerves were quite frayed, though I never imagined—" He trailed off, leaving the implication hanging. Mrs. Bantry leaned toward Miss Marple. "It's that envelope, isn't it, Jane? The one with the key and map. Agnes snatched it up like it contained poison, and Mr. Hartwell looked decidedly displeased when she did. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes continued their careful survey of the scene. The killer was here among them, she was certain. They had made their first mistake by choosing such a distinctive weapon, Miss Cordelia's own hatpin, to kill her niece. The symbolism felt deeply personal, almost ritualistic. As Inspector Craddock's black Wolseley crunched up the gravel drive, Miss Marple reflected that the villagers were already constructing their narratives, trying to fit this brutal reality into their comfortable understanding of Little Wickham. But secrets, she knew, were rarely self-contained. They always entangled others, and sometimes proved deadly. The hatpin was not merely a weapon, it was a punctuation mark at the end of a very long, complicated sentence that had been written by more than one hand. Inspector Dermot Craddock arrived with the measured efficiency of a man accustomed to transforming chaos into systematic inquiry. He surveyed the scene with sharp eyes that missed nothing: the scattered raffle tickets, the overturned teacups, the body of Agnes Thornfield now respectfully covered with Mrs. Bantry's tartan picnic rug. His presence immediately imposed order on the agitated crowd, though Miss Marple noticed how certain individuals seemed to shrink back, while others stepped forward with eager helpfulness. "Constable Davies," Craddock addressed the local officer crisply, "secure the immediate area. No one leaves the grounds until I've spoken with them." He knelt beside the body, examining the ornate hatpin without disturbing it. "Dr. Finch, you've confirmed death." "Immediate, I'm afraid," Dr. Finch replied. "The wound penetrated directly to the heart. The force required suggests deliberate intent rather than accident." Craddock rose, his gaze sweeping the assembled villagers. "I understand there was some disturbance involving an envelope before Miss Thornfield collapsed. I'll need to hear from everyone who witnessed the incident, starting with those closest to the deceased when it occurred." Mrs. Hartwell, still clutching the sewing basket as though it might escape, stepped forward with visible reluctance. Her account was delivered in a tremulous voice, emphasizing her shock at winning the raffle and her immediate recognition of Miss Cordelia's hatpin. She described how Agnes had desperately snatched the fallen envelope, claiming it was private property not included in the raffle. The poor woman seemed absolutely terrified, Mrs. Hartwell concluded, as if that envelope contained something dreadful. Geoffrey Hartwell positioned himself protectively beside his wife, his manner suggesting both concern and careful calculation. "Inspector, my wife has suffered a considerable shock. Miss Thornfield and I had been conducting business regarding her late aunt's estate. There were certain unresolved matters that had been causing her distress." "What sort of matters, Mr. Hartwell?" "Property transfers, primarily. Miss Thornfield seemed reluctant to finalize certain aspects of our agreement. She'd been under considerable strain about parting with family belongings." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly as she observed this exchange. How interesting that Mr. Hartwell should characterize Agnes's reluctance as mere sentimental attachment when his earlier reference to complications had carried distinctly threatening undertones. Dr. Finch provided crucial context about Agnes's recent mental state. "She consulted me last week about persistent anxiety and sleeplessness. When I suggested she might benefit from visiting relatives, she became quite agitated, insisting she couldn't leave Little Wickham until this was finished." I assumed she meant settling her aunt's affairs. Reverend Whitmore added another troubling detail. "Miss Thornfield came to see me after Sunday service. She seemed to want to confess something, but lost her nerve. She said some secrets were too dangerous to carry alone, but too dangerous to share as well." Sergeant Lake approached with the evidence, carefully bagged, the brass key and the sketched map that had fallen from the envelope. "The key appears designed for a safety deposit box, sir. The map shows Thornfield Manor grounds with a specific area marked near the old rose garden." A collective murmur arose from the crowd. Mrs. Pemberton voiced everyone's thoughts. "Miss Cordelia spent hours in that rose garden every day. If she hid something there, then someone was very determined to keep it hidden," Craddock concluded grimly. Miss Marple found herself studying the faces around her with increased attention. The revelation that Miss Cordelia's sealed envelope contained not a letter but a key and map fundamentally altered the nature of the secret. Letters revealed words, emotions, perhaps scandal. A key and map revealed location, something tangible, valuable, potentially exploitable. The motive had shifted from personal vendetta to material gain. She noticed how Dr. Finch kept glancing toward the Hartwells with barely concealed concern, as though his professional discretion prevented him from revealing something significant. Mrs. Pemberton fidgeted with her handkerchief, exchanging meaningful looks with the vicar whenever family secrets were mentioned. Most intriguingly, Mr. Ernest Periwinkle, the village historian, had positioned himself near the boundary hedge, apparently examining ivy, but clearly listening intently to every word. As the formal questioning continued, Miss Marple reflected that, in her experience, the most dangerous secrets were often those shared by multiple people, each believing they alone knew the full truth. The hatpin that killed Agnes Thornfield had belonged to her aunt, a deeply personal choice of weapon that suggested intimate knowledge of both women's lives. The afternoon shadows lengthened across the vicarage lawn, and the festive bunting now seemed mockingly cheerful against the backdrop of sudden death. Inspector Craddock methodically collected statements, but Miss Marple sensed that the real investigation was only beginning. Somewhere between the sewing basket, the brass key, and the old rose garden at Thornfield Manor lay the reason Agnes Thornfield had died, clutching her aunt's final secret. But secrets, Miss Marple knew, were rarely as simple as they appeared. This one had roots that ran much deeper than a single afternoon's tragedy. The following morning brought a deceptive calm to Little Wickham, as though the village were determined to pretend that nothing more serious than a misplaced hymnal had disrupted the previous day's festivities. Yet beneath this placid surface, Inspector Craddock methodically began the process of transforming yesterday's chaos into systematic inquiry, establishing his temporary headquarters in the vicarage's front parlor with its familiar scents of beeswax and Mrs. Pemberton's lavender polish. Miss Marple arrived promptly at 9 o'clock, knitting basket in hand, having spent the night at the village inn with Mrs. Bantry. Her friend trailed behind with barely concealed excitement, having reminded Inspector Craddock twice that Jane is extraordinarily helpful in these situations, you know. Craddock, who had encountered Miss Marple's particular talents before, welcomed her presence with genuine relief. "If you should happen to sit quietly in that corner and observe, Miss Marple, I shan't complain," he said cordially. "One sees so much more from the corners of rooms, Inspector," she replied, settling by the window with her knitting. "People think only the center matters." Dr. Marcus Finch was the first to be re-interviewed, arriving with the harassed appearance of a man who had spent a sleepless night contemplating the violent end of his patient. His revelations proved illuminating in ways that cast the previous day's events in an entirely new light. Miss Cordelia was quite a forceful personality, he began carefully. Dominating, some might say. She had an unfortunate habit of reminding people of past favors and of knowledge she possessed about their private affairs. Miss Marple's needles paused almost imperceptibly. "Blackmail, dear?" she inquired with mild interest. Dr. Finch flushed deeply. I wouldn't use such a harsh term, but she certainly enjoyed wielding power over others. These village places rarely forget old scandals, and Miss Cordelia had an excellent memory for indiscretions that others preferred to keep buried. This revelation transformed the entire complexion of the case. If Miss Cordelia had been collecting secrets for decades, the contents of that envelope might represent far more than a simple inheritance matter. Agnes's terror at its exposure suddenly made perfect sense. She had inherited not just her aunt's possessions, but her dangerous knowledge as well. However, it was the systematic examination of the previous day's events that produced the most damaging evidence against the obvious suspect. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell had not merely been present at the crucial moment. She had been positioned with suspicious precision to commit the crime. Mrs. Hartwell. Inspector Craddock addressed her with professional courtesy when she was brought in for formal questioning. Several witnesses place you directly beside Miss Thornfield when she collapsed. You also immediately identified the murder weapon as belonging to Miss Cordelia. This suggests considerable familiarity with the Thornfield household. Eleanor Hartwell's composure, which had held through the previous day's ordeal, finally began to crack under official scrutiny. Her hands trembled as she replied, "I was simply examining the beautiful craftsmanship. When I won the raffle, I wanted to appreciate what I'd acquired." But the evidence was mounting with uncomfortable clarity. Young Timothy Fletcher, the vicar's son, provided testimony that struck the gathering like a thunderbolt. "I saw Mrs. Hartwell talking to Miss Thornfield by the rose bushes earlier. Miss Thornfield was crying, and Mrs. Hartwell looked angry. They didn't see me because I was behind the garden shed." This revelation sent visible shock through the assembled witnesses. If Mrs. Hartwell had confronted Agnes privately before the public murder, it suggested premeditation rather than impulse. Geoffrey Hartwell's face darkened as he turned to his wife with an expression of bewilderment and growing alarm. "Eleanor, you never mentioned speaking with Miss Thornfield yesterday," he said quietly. "It was nothing important," she whispered. She was upset about the raffle, about parting with her aunt's things. I tried to comfort her. But comfort, Miss Marple reflected, was rarely delivered with the sort of intensity that reduced recipients to tears and left the comforter appearing angry. The physical evidence was equally damning. Constable Davies reported that while the hatpin's shaft bore no fingerprints, the ornate head showed traces of face powder, the sort ladies use to prevent shine. Mrs. Hartwell instinctively touched her powdered cheek upon hearing this, the unconscious gesture so revealing that several witnesses gasped audibly. Dr. Finch added another troubling detail. "Mrs. Hartwell consulted me privately last month about severe headaches and nervous tension. She seemed particularly distressed about unfinished business related to her new home. When I offered a mild sedative, she declined, saying she needed to remain alert." The case appeared to be resolving itself with textbook clarity. Mrs. Hartwell had opportunity, means, and now a suggested motive involving whatever Miss Cordelia's key might unlock. She had been observed in private confrontation with the victim, had been positioned perfectly to commit the crime, and had left physical evidence on the murder weapon. Inspector Craddock's expression grew increasingly grim as he reviewed his notes. "Mrs. Hartwell, I'm afraid the evidence suggests you had both opportunity and motive to—" "Wait." Miss Marple's quiet voice cut through the mounting tension with surprising authority. She had been so still throughout the proceedings that many had forgotten her presence entirely. Now she looked up from her knitting with those deceptively mild blue eyes that had seen through so many carefully constructed deceptions. "Inspector Craddock, if I might suggest proceeding with caution, I believe there may be considerably more to this tragedy than immediately apparent. The choice of weapon troubles me. Miss Cordelia's own hatpin to kill her niece. Such symbolism suggests depths of emotion and history that a simple property dispute cannot explain." She set down her knitting and regarded the assembled company thoughtfully. "Might we examine that brass key more carefully? And perhaps someone could tell us exactly what Miss Cordelia Thornfield was doing in her rose garden every single day for the past 40 years. I suspect the answer to that question will prove far more illuminating than the obvious evidence that has presented itself so conveniently this morning." The room fell silent as the implications of Miss Marple's words settled over them. The case that had seemed so straightforward suddenly revealed itself as merely the surface of much deeper and more dangerous waters. Inspector Craddock found himself in the peculiar position of having his investigation redirected by an elderly lady with knitting needles, but experience had taught him that Miss Marple's gentle interventions often marked the difference between solving a case and merely closing one. He studied the brass key with renewed attention, noting details that his initial examination had overlooked in the rush to build a case against the obvious suspect. "You're quite right about the weapon choice being theatrical, Miss Marple," he admitted. "But what specifically troubles you about Mrs. Hartwell's apparent guilt?" Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully as she considered her response. "In my experience, Inspector, when someone commits murder in the heat of passion or desperation, they use whatever comes to hand, a poker, a kitchen knife, even their bare hands. But to select Miss Cordelia's own hatpin, with all its personal significance, suggests either extraordinary calculation or—" She paused delicately. "Someone who wished the crime to carry a particular message." Dr. Finch shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "If I may elaborate on Miss Cordelia's character, Inspector, she was indeed what one might call a collector, not of objects, but of information. She had an extraordinary memory for village history and a talent for observing human weaknesses. Over the years, she accumulated knowledge about everyone's private affairs, their past indiscretions, their family secrets." "Blackmail?" Craddock asked directly. "Never so crude as actual blackmail," Dr. Finch replied carefully. "Rather, she wielded her knowledge like a gentle but persistent pressure. A reminder here, a meaningful glance there, a casual reference to old events that others preferred forgotten. People found themselves doing small favors, making donations to her charities, accommodating her wishes in ways they couldn't quite explain." Mrs. Pemberton bristled at this characterization. "Miss Cordelia was simply well informed about village life. There's nothing wrong with having a good memory." "Certainly not," Miss Marple agreed mildly, though one does wonder what sort of memories she felt compelled to preserve in writing. That envelope was sealed with red wax, after all, quite formal for a simple family document. Mr. Periwinkle cleared his throat nervously. "If I might contribute some historical context, Inspector. The brass key appears to be hand-forged rather than machine-made, probably dating to the 1920s. Miss Cordelia commissioned several custom pieces during that period. I have records of payments to local craftsmen for what she termed security arrangements." This revelation cast the investigation in an entirely different light. Rather than a modern bank deposit box, they were dealing with something far more personal and deliberately concealed. "She had a secret compartment built," Periwinkle continued, warming to his subject. "Old Mr. Hemlock, the village carpenter, mentioned it years later when he'd had too much ale at the Lamb and Flag. Said Miss Cordelia insisted on a hiding place that would survive time and prying eyes, but remain accessible to the right person with the right knowledge." Inspector Craddock examined the map more carefully. The penciled markings were precise, almost architectural in their detail. This isn't just marking a burial spot. It's providing specific measurements from fixed landmarks. Someone took considerable care to ensure this location could be found again. Miss Marple had been observing Eleanor Hartwell throughout this discussion, noting the woman's increasing agitation with each revelation. "Mrs. Hartwell, you seem particularly distressed by these discoveries. Had you any previous knowledge of Miss Cordelia's security arrangements?" Eleanor's hands trembled as she replied, "I knew nothing about any secret compartments or hidden documents. When Geoffrey decided to purchase the manor, I simply thought it seemed like a lovely place for retirement." But Miss Marple had noticed something that troubled her deeply. During yesterday's fete, before the raffle drawing, Eleanor Hartwell had studied the sewing basket with unusual intensity, not the casual interest of a potential winner, but the focused attention of someone searching for specific details. The sort of examination one might make when confirming the presence of something long suspected. "Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly, "might I suggest that before we proceed further with accusations, we examine both the rose garden and Miss Cordelia's study? I suspect we shall find that this mystery has roots extending much deeper into the past than yesterday's tragedy, and perhaps we shall discover that poor Agnes died not because of what she knew, but because of what someone feared she was about to learn." Geoffrey Hartwell had remained notably silent throughout the discussion, but now he spoke with careful precision. Inspector, I purchased Thornfield Manor through entirely legitimate channels. If there are hidden compartments or buried items on the property, I had no knowledge of them. My wife and I are as surprised by these revelations as anyone. Yet Miss Marple noticed how his eyes kept returning to his wife's face, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. There were undercurrents in this marriage that the tragedy had brought to the surface, secrets that perhaps even spouses had kept from each other. As the morning progressed and arrangements were made to search both the manor and its grounds, Miss Marple reflected that the sewing basket had indeed contained a secret worth killing for. But like many family secrets, this one appeared to involve not just one generation, but several, reaching back through decades of carefully maintained silence to some long-ago event that still possessed the power to destroy lives. The question now was not simply who had killed Agnes Thornfield, but who had been desperate enough to murder her to prevent the exposure of truths that Miss Cordelia had spent 40 years keeping buried in her rose garden and locked away in her private sanctuary. The search of Thornfield Manor commenced that afternoon with the methodical precision Inspector Craddock brought to all his investigations, though Miss Marple suspected the house itself had been anticipating this intrusion for quite some time. The Georgian facade bore its age gracefully, but there was something expectant in the way the windows caught the light, as if the building were holding its breath. Miss Cordelia's study remained exactly as she had left it, preserved by Geoffrey Hartwell's instructions until estate matters were resolved. The room felt suspended in time, heavy with accumulated secrets and the lingering presence of its former occupant. Books lined every wall, their leather spines bearing titles in multiple languages, while a massive oak desk commanded views of both the rose garden and the approach drive, positioning that spoke of a mind that valued both privacy and surveillance. Miss Marple moved through the space with careful attention, noting the strategic placement of furniture, the absence of personal photographs, and most significantly, the way Eleanor Hartwell hovered at the room's periphery, like someone afraid to cross an invisible boundary. Dr. Finch's examination of the built-in bookcases proved immediately fruitful. "These shelves have been modified," he announced, his practiced fingers locating a hidden mechanism behind a row of gardening manuals. The false panel slid aside to reveal a narrow cavity fitted with a small shelf, upon which rested a tarnished silver casket whose brass lock perfectly matched the key from Agnes's envelope. The casket's contents proved both illuminating and devastating. Inside, carefully preserved, lay a collection of letters tied with faded blue ribbon, all addressed to "My Dearest C" and signed simply J. Beneath these rested a small leather-bound diary bearing Miss Cordelia's distinctive handwriting. Inspector Craddock examined the letters with growing concern. The elegant script spoke of a clandestine affair, deep remorse for choices made, and promises of return when circumstances allowed. But it was Miss Cordelia's diary that provided the most chilling insights into recent events. Miss Marple read the final entries aloud, her voice steady despite their disturbing content. "Agnes is asking questions. She suspects something. Jay's child is here, in Little Wickham. The truth will destroy everything. Hartwell means to expose it all, but Agnes must not learn. Not yet." She looked up meaningfully. The final entry, written just days before her death. "The child has come home unknowing. God forgive me for what I've done." The implications hung heavy in the study's stifling air, but it was the discovery in the rose garden that transformed suspicion into horrifying certainty. Following the map's precise measurements, Constable Davies unearthed a second container, a simple wooden box buried beneath the ancient climbing rose that had dominated that corner of the garden for decades. Within the box, preserved among dried rose petals, lay a birth certificate dated 1923 and a yellowed photograph. The certificate bore the name Eleanor Thornfield, with Cordelia listed as mother, unmarried. The father's name had been deliberately obscured with ink, but beneath the scratched-out text, the original entry remained partially visible. Geoffrey Hartwell. The photograph showed a young woman unmistakably recognizable as Miss Cordelia, holding an infant, while beside her stood a man whose strong jawline and piercing eyes were devastatingly familiar to everyone present. The silence that followed was profound and terrible. Eleanor Hartwell's face had drained of all color, while Geoffrey stared at the evidence as if it might transform through sheer force of will. "Eleanor," he whispered finally, his voice hollow with dawning horror. "You're Cordelia's daughter, my daughter." Eleanor's composure shattered completely. "She gave me away," she said through tears. "Told everyone I was her sister's child, sent me to Yorkshire. I only learned the truth at 18 when she summoned me back to explain that my father had married someone else and could never acknowledge me. She never told me your name." Miss Marple felt the familiar chill that accompanied moments when human tragedy revealed its full dimensions. This was not simple greed or jealousy. It was the collision of past and present, of love corrupted by deception across generations. "When you decided to purchase the manor," Dr. Finch said quietly, "when you and Eleanor fell in love and married, Cordelia knew exactly who you both were. She allowed you to walk into this horror deliberately." Geoffrey's voice broke as understanding dawned. "We've been living as a husband and wife, not knowing we were father and daughter. The legal implications alone." Miss Marple understood now why Agnes had been so terrified of the envelope's contents. The secret wasn't merely scandalous, it was devastating enough to destroy multiple lives and potentially constitute criminal activity. Someone had murdered Agnes, not to prevent exposure of old secrets, but to prevent the destruction of a love that had unknowingly crossed the most forbidden of boundaries. The question remained: who among them had been desperate enough to commit murder to keep this terrible truth buried forever? The weight of revelation settled over Little Wickham like morning mist, seeping into every corner of village life with the persistent inevitability that accompanies truly shocking news. By the following morning, Inspector Craddock found himself dealing not merely with a murder investigation, but with the unraveling of a family tragedy that had been decades in the making. The comfortable certainties of village life had been shattered, leaving everyone to reassess what they thought they knew about the Thornfield family and their secrets. The return of James. Thornfield. Miss Marple's careful examination of the letters had revealed something that transformed the entire timeline of events. The correspondence wasn't simply historical. Several bore recent postmarks, indicating that Miss Cordelia's mysterious lover had been very much alive and actively involved in recent events. Inspector Craddock's systematic inquiry revealed that a gentleman named James Thornfield had indeed been staying at the King's Arms in nearby Wickham Junction for the past month, registering as Miss Cordelia's brother returned from Australia. The revelation struck Geoffrey Hartwell with the force of a physical blow. "James," he whispered, his face draining of color. "My father's name was James. He disappeared when I was 12, supposedly to Australia on business. My mother always claimed he died there, but she never could produce proper documentation." Eleanor's reaction was even more profound. Her hands trembled as she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. 3 nights ago, I received a message at our hotel. An elderly gentleman at the King's Arms claimed to know my mother and wished to meet me urgently. When I arrived, he took one look at me and began weeping, calling me my daughter, my beautiful daughter. I thought he was confused, possibly suffering from dementia. She paused, struggling to continue. When I mentioned that I'd married Geoffrey Hartwell, he collapsed completely. I called for help, but he was already gone. "Heart failure," the doctor said. I was so shaken by the encounter that I searched his room afterward, trying to understand who he was and why he'd wanted to see me. Dr. Finch's deeper involvement. The investigation took another significant turn when Dr. Finch, clearly struggling with his conscience, provided additional context that cast the recent events in an entirely new light. His relationship with Miss Cordelia had been far more complex than he'd initially revealed, extending beyond simple medical consultation into the realm of emotional manipulation that had characterized so many of her relationships. Miss Cordelia knew about a medical incident from my early career, Dr. Finch admitted with obvious reluctance. A patient died under circumstances that, while cleared by official inquiry, left me with profound guilt. She used this knowledge not for outright blackmail, but for what she termed gentle persuasion. Free medical care for certain villagers, support for her charitable causes, and, most significantly, my cooperation in managing Agnes's emotional state. This revelation was particularly damaging because it established Dr. Finch as someone with both intimate knowledge of the Thornfield family secrets and access to Miss Cordelia's personal effects, including the ornate hatpin that had become the murder weapon. His medical training would have given him precise knowledge of how to inflict a fatal wound, and his position in the community provided perfect cover for moving freely among the festival crowds. Miss Marple's analysis. Miss Marple had been listening to these revelations with the careful attention she brought to all human confessions, her knitting needles moving in the steady rhythm that indicated deep thought. When she finally spoke, her observations cut through the emotional turmoil to the heart of the matter. "The choice of weapon continues to trouble me greatly," she said in her gentle but penetrating manner. Miss Cordelia's own hatpin used to kill her niece at a public gathering where the symbolism would be unmistakable to anyone who understood the family dynamics. This wasn't simply murder. It was a statement, a final punctuation mark on decades of manipulation and control. She paused, organizing her thoughts with characteristic precision. Agnes was fundamentally different from her aunt. Where Cordelia hoarded secrets to wield them as weapons, Agnes sought guidance about how to handle the terrible knowledge she'd inherited. Dr. Finch has confirmed that she consulted him. We know she spoke with Reverend Whitmore. Mrs. Pemberton has admitted that Agnes came to the vicarage kitchen the evening before the fête, desperately seeking advice about putting an end to Miss Cordelia's power to harm. The village response, the systematic questioning of other villagers, revealed the extent to which Miss Cordelia's influence had permeated Little Wickham society. Mrs. Pemberton, when pressed, admitted that Agnes had been in considerable distress during her kitchen visit, speaking in fragmented sentences about having discovered something terrible in writing that could destroy several lives. Agnes had been torn between her moral obligation to reveal the truth and her fear of the consequences such revelation would bring. Mr. Periwinkle, the village historian, provided additional context about Miss Cordelia's methods of maintaining control. She had an extraordinary memory for village history and human weaknesses, he explained. Over the years, she accumulated knowledge about everyone's private affairs, their past indiscretions, their family secrets. She never engaged in crude blackmail, but rather wielded her knowledge like a gentle but persistent pressure, i.e. the narrowing focus. As the investigation progressed, Inspector Craddock found himself dealing with a case where multiple people had compelling motives for wanting to prevent Agnes from revealing her aunt's final secret. The discovery that James Thornfield, Eleanor's father and Geoffrey's father, had died of shock upon learning of their unwitting incestuous marriage added another layer of tragedy to an already complex situation. However, Miss Marple's attention remained focused on the symbolic aspects of the crime. "The killer chose Miss Cordelia's hatpin deliberately," she observed. "This suggests someone who had been deeply affected by her manipulations. Someone who saw Agnes not as an individual, but as an extension of her aunt's power. The murder was committed in the most public possible setting, ensuring maximum symbolic impact." Dr. Finch's access to Cordelia's personal effects, combined with his medical knowledge and his history of being manipulated by her, made him an increasingly compelling suspect. Yet Miss Marple sensed there were still threads in this complex tapestry that hadn't been properly examined. The truth, she suspected, lay not just in who had means and opportunity, but in understanding the deeper psychological dynamics that had driven someone to transform a peaceful village fete into the stage for such a dramatically symbolic murder. As evening approached and the investigation continued, Miss Marple reflected that they were dealing with someone who had learned Miss Cordelia's methods all too well. Someone who understood that the most effective way to send a message was through carefully chosen symbolism, public humiliation, and the sort of pointed violence that would be remembered long after the immediate shock had faded. The morning after the devastating revelations about the Thornfield family brought an atmosphere of profound unease to Little Wickham, as though the very foundations of village life had shifted beneath everyone's feet. Inspector Craddock found himself dealing with a case that had evolved far beyond simple murder into a complex web of family tragedy, moral compromise, and the dangerous consequences of long-buried secrets finally surfacing. The weight of truth. Miss Marple arrived at the vicarage early, her knitting basket in hand and her pale blue eyes already alert to the subtle changes in human behavior that trauma invariably produced. She had spent the sleepless hours of the night reflecting on the symbolic nature of Agnes Thornfield's murder, and she was beginning to perceive a pattern that troubled her deeply. The choice of Miss Cordelia's own hatpin as the murder weapon spoke of intimate knowledge not just of the Thornfield family history, but of the psychological dynamics that had governed relationships within Little Wickham for decades. Dr. Marcus Finch appeared at the vicarage shortly after breakfast, his usually steady demeanor replaced by something approaching desperation. His hands trembled as he requested a private word with Inspector Craddock, and Miss Marple noted how his eyes kept returning to the window that offered a view of Thornfield Manor, as though he were watching for some anticipated catastrophe. "Inspector," Dr. Finch began, his voice strained with the weight of confession, "I must tell you something that may fundamentally alter your understanding of recent events. My relationship with Miss Cordelia extended far beyond simple medical consultation. She had persuaded me to provide certain services that violated both professional ethics and legal boundaries." The revelation that followed cast the entire investigation in a new and disturbing light. Dr. Finch admitted to falsifying medical records regarding Eleanor's birth, ensuring that official documentation would never reveal her true parentage. More significantly, he had been providing Miss Cordelia with detailed information about various villagers' medical conditions, personal struggles, and family secrets gleaned through his professional practice. She used this information not for crude blackmail, Dr. Finch explained with obvious self-loathing, but for what she termed gentle guidance of village affairs. A word here about someone's drinking problem, a hint there about marital difficulties, a casual mention of financial struggles. She wielded knowledge like a surgeon's scalpel, making precise incisions into people's lives to achieve her desired outcomes. Mrs. Pemberton's deeper involvement. Miss Marple's attention sharpened as Dr. Finch revealed another crucial detail. Mrs. Pemberton had not merely been an unwitting recipient of village confidences. She had been Miss Cordelia's primary collaborator in gathering and disseminating sensitive information. The vicar's wife had access to confessions shared over kitchen tea, private conversations during church preparations, and the intimate details that people revealed when seeking comfort from their spiritual community. Mrs. Pemberton would report back to Miss Cordelia regularly, Dr. Finch continued with growing anguish. Not maliciously, she believed, but as part of what she saw as pastoral care. She thought she was helping Miss Cordelia provide appropriate charitable assistance to those in need. She never realized how that information was actually being used. This revelation transformed Mrs. Pemberton from an innocent bystander into a potentially crucial figure in the tragedy. Her organization of the fete, her insistence on the immediate raffle drawing, her positioning of various participants, all of these seemingly innocent actions took on new significance when viewed through the lens of her long collaboration with Miss Cordelia. Inspector Craddock examined this new evidence with growing concern. "Dr. Finch, You're suggesting that Mrs. Pemberton might have been protecting this arrangement by silencing Agnes. I'm suggesting, Dr. Finch replied carefully, that when Agnes discovered the full extent of her aunt's manipulations and threatened to expose everything publicly, several people faced complete destruction of their carefully constructed lives. Mrs. Pemberton's position as the moral center of the parish, my medical practice, even the financial stability of various village institutions that had benefited from Miss Cordelia's charitable guidance, all of it would have collapsed. Miss Marple's psychological test. Miss Marple had been listening to this confession with the careful attention she brought to all human revelations, but her focus remained fixed on the deeper psychological currents that drove people to desperate acts. She excused herself from the formal interview and made her way to the vicarage kitchen, where she found Mrs. Pemberton preparing tea with the sort of determined normalcy that often masked profound internal turmoil. "My dear Mrs. Pemberton," Miss Marple began with her characteristic gentle directness, "I wonder if you might help me understand something that's been troubling me about poor Agnes's final moments." Mrs. Pemberton's hands stilled on the tea service, and Miss Marple noted the slight tremor that ran through her fingers. "Of course, Miss Marple. Anything I can do to help." "It's about the timing of events yesterday," Miss Marple continued, settling herself comfortably at the kitchen table. "You mentioned that the raffle tickets had been tampered with, necessitating an immediate drawing. But I've been wondering, did you actually examine those tickets yourself? Or did someone else bring the problem to your attention?" The question struck Mrs. Pemberton with visible force. Her face drained of color, and she gripped the edge of the kitchen counter as though seeking physical support. Someone mentioned there might be duplicate numbers. I thought it best to resolve the matter quickly." "How wise of you," Miss Marple agreed mildly. "And the positioning of the stalls? I noticed that Mrs. Hartwell was placed quite close to Agnes during the crucial moments. Was that arrangement your decision as well?" Mrs. Pemberton's composure began to crack visibly. "Miss Marple, I don't understand what you're suggesting. I simply tried to organize a successful fate for the parish. If something went wrong, if poor Agnes was hurt because of my arrangements—" "Oh, my dear," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "I'm not suggesting you intended any harm to Agnes, but I am wondering whether someone might have taken advantage of your natural efficiency and organizational skills to create the precise conditions necessary for what happened. Someone who knew that you would follow through on suggestions about ticket problems or stall arrangements without questioning their motives." The psychological pressure of Miss Marple's gentle but persistent questioning finally achieved its intended effect. Mrs. Pemberton sank into a chair, her carefully maintained composure dissolving entirely. "She came to me 3 nights ago," Mrs. Pemberton whispered, her voice barely audible. "Agnes. She was carrying a box of her aunt's papers, and she was absolutely distraught. She said she'd discovered things about Miss Cordelia that would destroy half the village if they came to light. She wanted my advice about what to do." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused, sensing that they were approaching the heart of the matter. "And what advice did you give her, dear?" "I told her that some secrets were better left buried," Mrs. Pemberton replied, tears beginning to flow, "that exposing Miss Cordelia's methods would hurt innocent people who had simply been trying to survive difficult circumstances, but Agnes was determined. She said the truth had to come out, no matter the cost." The kitchen fell silent except for the gentle ticking of the mantel clock and Mrs. Pemberton's quiet weeping. Miss Marple sensed that they were very close to understanding not just who had killed Agnes Thornfield, but why the murder had been committed with such deliberate symbolism at such a public venue. "Mrs. Pemberton," Miss Marple said softly, "I believe someone else was present during your conversation with Agnes. Someone who realized that she posed an immediate threat to everything they had worked to protect. Someone who decided that Agnes's moral crusade had to be stopped, no matter the cost." Mrs. Pemberton looked up with eyes full of terror and dawning realization. "You think someone was listening?" Someone who heard everything Agnes said about exposing the truth? Miss Marple's pale blue eyes held a certainty that made Mrs. Pemberton's blood run cold. I think, my dear, that someone very close to you has been playing a much deeper game than any of us realized, and I believe that person used your genuine desire to help Agnes as the perfect cover for ensuring that her dangerous revelations would never see the light of day. As the implications of Miss Marple's words settled over the kitchen like a shroud, both women realized that the true murderer had been hiding in plain sight all along, using the very bonds of trust and community that held Little Wickham together as weapons in a deadly game of deception and control. The afternoon light filtering through Miss Cordelia's study windows seemed to cast everything in shades of judgment as Miss Marple prepared to execute her final, delicate maneuver. Inspector Craddock had arranged for all the principal figures to gather in the very room where so many secrets had been born, understanding that sometimes the most effective interrogations occurred not in sterile police stations but in spaces heavy with psychological significance. The final gathering. Eleanor Hartwell sat rigidly beside the window, her face bearing the hollow expression of someone whose entire understanding of reality had been shattered by the previous day's revelations. Geoffrey paced near the fireplace with restless energy, his movements betraying the internal turmoil of a man grappling with truths that had destroyed not only his marriage, but his very sense of identity. Dr. Finch occupied a corner chair, his medical bag at his feet like a symbol of the professional ethics he had compromised, while Mrs. Pemberton clutched her handbag with white knuckles, her usually immaculate appearance showing signs of the strain that had consumed her since their kitchen conversation. Reverend Whitmore entered last, his gentle face marked by the sort of profound distress that comes from witnessing the destruction of everything one holds sacred. He took his position near his wife with protective instincts that Miss Marple found both touching and telling. Miss Marple's psychological analysis. I've been reflecting extensively on the nature of poor Agnes's murder, Miss Marple began, her knitting needles moving in their characteristic steady rhythm that so many had learned to associate with impending revelation. The choice of Miss Cordelia's own hatpin was deeply personal, almost ritualistic in its symbolism. It spoke of someone who saw Agnes not as an individual victim, but as an extension of her aunt's corrupting influence. Someone who believed that by destroying Agnes with Miss Cordelia's own weapon, they were completing some sort of cosmic justice. She paused, allowing her words to settle over the assembled group like morning frost. But what troubled me most profoundly was the timing and location. Why commit murder at the fete, in full view of the entire village, when there were countless opportunities for a more private killing? The answer lies in understanding that this wasn't simply about preventing Agnes from revealing secrets. It was about making a statement that would be understood by everyone who had been touched by Miss Cordelia's decades of manipulation. Dr. Finch shifted uncomfortably. You're suggesting the killer wanted to send a message? I'm suggesting, Miss Marple replied with gentle precision, that someone had been planning this moment for a considerable time. Someone who had watched Miss Cordelia destroy lives with her gentle blackmail and psychological manipulation, who had seen good people reduced to complicity in her schemes, and who finally saw an opportunity to end her influence permanently by destroying both her heir and her dangerous legacy. The method revealed. Miss Marple's attention turned to Mrs. Pemberton with the sort of gentle focus that had unnerved countless guilty parties over the years. Mrs. Pemberton, you mentioned that Agnes came to you 3 nights ago with her aunt's papers. But I've been considering the sequence of events that followed with particular care. You see, someone had to arrange for Mrs. Hartwell to win that raffle. Someone with access to the tickets and the organizational authority to manipulate the drawing without arousing suspicion. Mrs. Pemberton's face went pale, but she maintained her composure with visible effort. I've already explained about the problems with duplicate numbers. I simply tried to resolve the situation as efficiently as possible. Yes, Miss Marple agreed mildly. But such efficiency requires advanced planning, doesn't it? Someone had to ensure that Mrs. Hartwell would be positioned near Agnes at precisely the right moment, that the sewing basket would be opened at exactly the right time, and that the resulting chaos would provide perfect cover for the actual murder. She set down her knitting and regarded Mrs. Pemberton with eyes that seemed to see straight through carefully constructed facades. But what truly revealed your involvement, my dear, was something much more subtle. When Agnes collapsed, everyone's natural attention was focused on her suffering. Everyone except you. You were watching Mrs. Hartwell's reaction, as though you were waiting to see whether your carefully orchestrated plan had succeeded in casting suspicion on the intended scapegoat. The forensic evidence. Inspector Craddock stepped forward with professional gravity. We've also discovered physical evidence that supports Miss Marple's deductions. The hatpin's ornate head bore traces of face powder, not from Mrs. Hartwell's compact as we initially assumed, but from yours, Mrs. Pemberton. The laboratory analysis confirmed the specific formulation matches your personal cosmetics exactly. Mrs. Pemberton's hands trembled as she touched her powdered cheek unconsciously, the gesture so revealing that several witnesses drew sharp breaths. Moreover, Craddock continued, we've traced your movements during the estate clearing at Thornfield Manor. You had access to Miss Cordelia's personal effects, including her jewelry box where the hatpin was kept. The manor's housekeeper confirms you spent considerable time alone in Miss Cordelia's bedroom, ostensibly selecting items for charitable donation. The psychological pressure. The accumulated weight of evidence and psychological analysis finally achieved its intended effect. Mrs. Pemberton's carefully maintained facade cracked completely, and the truth came pouring out with the force of long-suppressed guilt. She was going to destroy everything, Mrs. Pemberton whispered, her voice breaking under the strain of confession. Agnes had found Miss Cordelia's complete records, not just the family secrets about Geoffrey and Eleanor, but detailed accounts of everyone she had manipulated over the years. My role in gathering information through pastoral visits, Dr. Finch's ethical violations in falsifying records, the financial irregularities in the church accounts that Miss Cordelia had helped us conceal when the roof repairs exceeded our budget. Tears began streaming down her face as she continued with growing desperation. Agnes was determined to expose everything publicly at the fete. She said it was the only way to free the village from Miss Cordelia's lingering influence. But she didn't understand what that exposure would mean. Dr. Finch would lose his medical license. I would be removed from my position in disgrace. The parish would be bankrupted by scandal. Dozens of innocent people would be destroyed to satisfy her moral crusade. The confession complete, Mrs. Pemberton's admission revealed the meticulous planning that had gone into Agnes's murder. She had indeed manipulated the raffle to ensure Mrs. Hartwell's victory, positioning her as the perfect scapegoat with her obvious connections to both the manor and the family secrets. The fabricated problem with duplicate tickets had been entirely her creation, designed to generate urgency around the drawing and gather everyone's attention at precisely the right moment. I retrieved Miss Cordelia's hatpin during my final visit to collect personal items for the church sale, she admitted with obvious self-loathing. I knew its symbolic significance would point suspicion towards someone with intimate knowledge of the Thornfield family history. I waited until the moment when everyone was distracted by the envelope's contents. Agnes was so focused on protecting her aunt's final secret that she never saw me approach from behind. One precise thrust, delivered with the medical knowledge Dr. Finch had shared during our discussions of his wartime service, and it was over. She looked up at Miss Marple with a strange mixture of accusation and gratitude. I thought Mrs. Hartwell would be arrested immediately, and the case would be closed without anyone examining Miss Cordelia's records too closely. You saw through it all, didn't you? From your quiet corner, just like Miss Cordelia used to observe and manipulate. Miss Marple's final judgment. No, my dear, Miss Marple replied with profound sadness. Miss Cordelia saw opportunities to control and exploit human weakness. I see patterns of behavior that reveal when people have been pushed beyond their moral boundaries. The difference is that Miss Cordelia used her observations to accumulate power, while I hope to use mine to prevent further tragedy. As Inspector Craddock formally arrested Mrs. Pemberton for the murder of Agnes Thornfield, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic irony that had driven the entire case. In attempting to protect the village from the consequences of Miss Cordelia's manipulations, Mrs. Pemberton had adopted her methods completely, using deception, manipulation, and ultimately violence to achieve her goals. She had become the very thing she claimed to be fighting against, proving once again that the most dangerous people are often those who convince themselves they're acting for the greater good. The secret folded inside the sewing basket had indeed been worth killing for, but the price had been far higher than anyone could have imagined. As the peaceful afternoon dissolved into the harsh realities of justice and consequence, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and reflected that human nature, in all its complexity and contradiction, remained the most challenging mystery of all. The days following Mrs. Pemberton's arrest descended upon Little Wickham like the aftermath of a severe storm, leaving the village to assess damage that went far deeper than broken branches or displaced roof tiles. The comfortable certainties that had governed parish life for decades lay in ruins, and the residents found themselves navigating a landscape transformed by the revelation of secrets that had festered beneath their peaceful surface for far too long. The immediate reckoning. The vicarage, once the moral heart of Little Wickham, now stood as a monument to the dangerous consequences of good intentions corrupted by fear and compromise. Reverend Whitmore moved through his duties with the hollow precision of a man whose faith had been shaken to its very foundations. His gentle nature, which had made him beloved by his congregation, had also rendered him blind to the psychological warfare being conducted in his own household. She truly believed she was protecting everyone, he confided to Miss Marple during one of their final conversations, his voice carrying the weight of a man trying to reconcile love with horror. Celia never saw herself as a murderer, but as a guardian of the village's peace. That's what makes forgiveness so difficult, and yet, of course, one must try. Miss Marple nodded with gentle understanding. The worst tragedies, I've found, are rarely committed by those who set out to do evil, Reverend. They're done by people who convince themselves that the end justifies the means. Your wife feared scandal more than she trusted truth, and that is indeed an old and dangerous story. Eleanor and Geoffrey Hartwell had departed Little Wickham within hours of Mrs. Pemberton's confession. Their marriage dissolved not by law, but by the terrible knowledge that made their continued union impossible. Eleanor left first, taking only a small suitcase and speaking to no one, her face bearing the hollow expression of someone whose entire understanding of love and identity had been shattered beyond repair. Geoffrey followed that evening after signing papers that transferred Thornfield Manor to the National Trust, ensuring that the house where so much tragedy had unfolded would never again serve as a private residence. Dr. Marcus Finch faced his professional ruin with the dignity of a man who had long anticipated this moment. The General Medical Council's investigation would undoubtedly result in the loss of his license, but he seemed almost relieved to finally shed the burden of complicity he had carried for so many years. He spent his final days in Little Wickham providing medical care without payment, speaking openly about the moral compromises that had led to his downfall. The village transformation. The practical consequences rippled through every aspect of community life like stones thrown into still water. The church accounts required forensic examination to determine the extent of financial irregularities that Miss Cordelia's influence had helped conceal. Several prominent families found themselves facing uncomfortable questions about past favors and accommodations that now appeared in a very different light. Miss Cordelia's meticulously kept records, when finally examined in their entirety, revealed the full scope of her decades-long manipulation. There were ledgers detailing financial improprieties, letters alluding to illicit affairs, and notes on various villagers' vulnerabilities, all compiled with a chilling detachment that spoke of a mind that saw human lives as mere data points to be exploited. The exposure of these records brought fresh waves of discomfort and scandal to Little Wickham, as long-buried indiscretions were dragged into unwelcome daylight. Miss Marple observed this painful unraveling with her characteristic blend of detachment and profound empathy. "It's rather like a garden, isn't it?" she remarked to Mrs. Bantry during one of their final walks through the village. "If you allow certain weeds to grow unchecked, even the most beautiful flowers will eventually be choked out. Miss Cordelia was a very particular kind of weed, and Mrs. Pemberton, in trying to prune it, ended up poisoning the entire bed." The legal resolution, Mrs. Pemberton's trial, when it came some months later, was mercifully swift. Represented by competent counsel and supported, at a careful distance, by her husband, she entered a plea that acknowledged her guilt while emphasizing her fractured mental state at the time of the killing. The jury, composed of people who themselves understood the complex moral economies of small communities, found their sympathies pulled between horror at the deed and comprehension of the fear that had driven it. The verdict reflected that uncomfortable compromise, guilty of manslaughter rather than murder, with a recommendation for leniency based on mental disturbance. Inspector Craddock, visiting Miss Marple some time later, observed with characteristic directness, "I can't help feeling that nobody really got what they deserved in this case." "Oh, my dear Inspector," Miss Marple replied, pouring him tea with steady hands. "In my experience, almost nobody ever does. Life is not a properly balanced ledger. Evil is rarely punished as neatly as one would wish, and good is almost never rewarded in proportion to its cost. But consequences do arrive, all the same." Miss Marple's final reflections. As her time in Little Wickham drew to a close, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the intricate web of human motivations that had made this tragedy not only possible, but perhaps inevitable. She had encountered many cases where secrets proved deadly, but rarely had she witnessed such systematic corruption of an entire community's moral foundation. The most dangerous people, she reflected, settling into a familiar position beneath the chestnut tree for the last time, are often those who convince themselves they're protecting others. Mrs. Pemberton genuinely believed she was saving Little Wickham from scandal and financial ruin. Miss Cordelia probably convinced herself that her manipulations provided stability and guidance. Even Dr. Finch thought his ethical compromises served a greater good. She paused in her knitting, considering the complex pattern of justifications and rationalizations that had ultimately led to Agnes Thornfield's death. The tragedy is that each of them might have been right in some limited sense. The exposure of Miss Cordelia's records would indeed have caused tremendous damage to innocent people, but the alternative, maintaining a community built on secrets and fear, proved even more destructive in the end. The departure, Miss Marple's departure from Little Wickham, was marked by the same quiet efficiency that had characterized her investigation. She packed her knitting basket with methodical care and took a final walk through the village that had revealed so much about the dangerous complexity of human nature. The rose garden at Thornfield Manor, where Miss Cordelia had spent decades tending her flowers while nurturing her secrets, showed signs of neglect. The climbing rose under which the family documents had been buried was beginning to wither, as though the exposure of its hidden burden had drained it of life. Miss Marple reflected that some secrets, like some plants, required darkness to survive, and bringing them into the light often proved fatal to everything they had touched. As the train carried her back to St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple contemplated the lesson that emerged from every case she encountered, that human beings were capable of extraordinary self-deception when justifying their actions, but that truth, however painful, was ultimately less destructive than the elaborate lies people constructed to avoid it. The eternal pattern, Outside her cottage window, Miss Marple could see her own garden, where a robin engaged in fierce territorial negotiation with a sparrow twice its size. She smiled at the familiar sight, recognizing in it the eternal patterns of competition, survival, and adaptation that governed all living things, including the residents of seemingly peaceful English villages. "People are so very much the same everywhere," she murmured to herself, taking up her knitting needles once more. Dear, silly, frightened, selfish, courageous creatures that they are. Miss Cordelia used that knowledge to frighten and control. Mrs. Pemberton used it to excuse a crime she knew in her heart to be wrong. Poor Agnes tried, very clumsily, to make it a standard of absolute right. None of them quite managed kindness, which is, I have always thought, the only safe use for understanding human nature. The secret folded inside the sewing basket had indeed been worth killing for, but only because the alternative of facing the truth had seemed too terrible to bear. In the end, Little Wickham would survive, as communities always do, by gradually transforming tragedy into cautionary tale. But Miss Marple would remember adding this case to her vast catalogue of human behaviour and reflecting once again that the most important mysteries were not those involving hidden objects or concealed identities, but the eternal question of why people chose to act as they did when faced with impossible moral choices. As she began work on a new knitting pattern, deceptively simple at first glance, but full of hidden complexities that only revealed their logic when viewed as a complete design, Miss Marple anticipated that somewhere ahead lay another community, harboring its own dangerous secrets, another tragedy waiting to unfold, and another opportunity to untangle the beautiful and terrible complexity of human nature in all its contradictory glory. The months that followed Mrs. Pemberton's trial settled over Little Wickham like the gradual transition from autumn to winter, a slow, inevitable transformation that left the village forever changed beneath its familiar surface. The comfortable certainties that had governed parish life for decades had been shattered, and the residents found themselves learning to navigate relationships built on transparency rather than the intricate web of mutual obligation and controlled information that had previously sustained their community. The reckoning of lives. Mrs. Pemberton's fate was determined with the sort of merciful pragmatism that English justice sometimes displayed when confronted with cases that defied simple categorization. Rather than a harsh prison sentence, she was placed in a supervised institution where her organizational talents were channeled into harmless pursuits. Cataloging library books, managing charitable knitting circles, and maintaining detailed records of chapel attendance. Reverend Whitmore's monthly letters to Miss Marple revealed a woman who had found a strange peace in routine tasks, though she continued to believe that her actions had ultimately protected the village from something worse than murder. "She asks after the parish constantly," the Reverend wrote in his careful script. "She needs to believe that her sacrifice preserved something valuable, even if the cost was more terrible than she could have imagined. I haven't the heart to disillusion her entirely, though I struggle daily with the theological implications of offering comfort to someone who committed such a calculated crime." Dr. Marcus Finch faced his professional destruction with the dignity of a man who had long anticipated this moment. The General Medical Council's investigation resulted in the permanent revocation of his license, but he remained in Little Wickham, opening a small herbalist shop that served the community in ways both practical and symbolic. His transformation from respected physician to humble shopkeeper represented a form of penance that seemed to bring him genuine peace. Villagers who remembered his decades of compassionate care found themselves able to separate the man from his moral compromises, gradually rebuilding trust on a foundation of shared acknowledgement rather than willful blindness. The Hartwells departed Little Wickham within days of Mrs. Pemberton's confession, their marriage dissolved not by law, but by the terrible knowledge that made their continued union impossible. Eleanor left first, taking only a small suitcase and speaking to no one, her face bearing the hollow expression of someone whose entire understanding of love and identity had been shattered beyond repair. Geoffrey followed that evening, after signing papers that transferred Thornfield Manor to the National Trust, ensuring that the house where so much tragedy had unfolded would never again serve as a private residence. Neither was seen in the village again, though occasional reports filtered back through the efficient networks of country gossip. Eleanor had settled by the sea in Cornwall, while Geoffrey had taken positions of quiet responsibility in various distant places, always competent, always courteous, always slightly apart. The transformation of place. Thornfield Manor's conversion to a National Trust property proceeded with the sort of respectful efficiency that transformed private tragedy into public heritage. The house opened to visitors as a museum of Victorian domestic life, its rooms carefully preserved and interpreted for tourists who walked through the elegant spaces entirely unaware of the human dramas that had unfolded within those walls. The rose garden where Miss Cordelia had spent decades tending her flowers while nurturing her secrets was restored to something approaching its former glory, though the climbing rose that had concealed the family documents never fully recovered from its traumatic uprooting. The sewing basket that had set so much in motion eventually took its place in a glass display case, labeled with careful neutrality as "Work Basket, Mid-20th Century," containing assorted sewing materials. The brass key and map were stored in the Trust's secure archives, their story hinted at only in discreet guidebook language about significant family upheaval in the mid-1900s. Visitors paused before the display with mild curiosity, rarely guessing that this simple domestic object had been the catalyst for revelations that reconfigured several lives and ended at least two. The village renewed. Reverend Whitmore requested a transfer to a parish in Cornwall, unable to continue his ministry in a place where every familiar face reminded him of his wife's terrible transformation. His replacement, Reverend Sarah Matthews, arrived with a philosophy of radical transparency that made some of the older residents deeply uncomfortable but gradually won over those who had grown weary of secrets and their consequences. She established new traditions for parish governance that emphasized collective decision-making and open financial reporting, slowly rebuilding social bonds on a foundation of shared purpose rather than shared secrets. The practical consequences of the revelations rippled through every aspect of community life. Church accounts required forensic examination to determine the extent of financial irregularities that Miss Cordelia's influence had helped conceal. Several prominent families found themselves facing uncomfortable questions about past accommodations that now appeared in a very different light. Yet gradually, painfully, the village learned to function without the elaborate systems of mutual dependence and controlled information that had previously governed its social relationships. Miss Marple's continuing observations. From her cottage in St. Mary, Mead, Miss Marple maintained a careful correspondence with several Little Wickham residents, tracking the village's gradual healing with the professional interest that a doctor might show in a patient's recovery. Her letters with Reverend Matthews proved particularly illuminating, revealing the slow process by which a community learns to distinguish between necessary transparency and the sort of brutal honesty that poor Agnes had thought essential. The most difficult aspect, Reverend Matthews wrote in one of her monthly updates, is helping people understand that refusing to keep dangerous secrets doesn't require exposing every private vulnerability. There's a difference between transparency and indiscriminate disclosure. The art lies in learning to distinguish between the two. Miss Marple found this observation particularly astute, reflecting as it did on one of the central moral questions raised by the case. She had come to understand that Agnes's determination to expose all of her aunt's machinations, while morally admirable in its absolute commitment to truth, had failed to account for the collateral damage such revelations would inflict on innocent parties. Mrs. Pemberton's murderous response, while inexcusable, had been motivated by genuine concern for people who would be destroyed by indiscriminate disclosure. The case had attracted attention from criminologists and social psychologists interested in the dynamics of small community crime, resulting in several academic papers analyzing how social isolation and moral pressure could transform respectable citizens into calculating criminals. Miss Marple read these analyses with interest, though she found them somewhat bloodless in their reduction of human complexity to sociological categories. The enduring lessons. As winter deepened and the first anniversary of the tragedy approached, Miss Marple reflected on the cyclical nature of human behavior and community life. Villages like Little Wickham appeared stable and unchanging from the outside, but they were actually in constant flux, shaped by the personalities and choices of their residents in ways that could accumulate over decades into either great good or terrible harm. The Christmas preparations in Little Wickham that year were subdued but genuine, marked by a conscious effort to establish new traditions rather than simply continuing practices that carried uncomfortable associations. A photograph of the village Christmas tree, erected in the spot where Agnes Thornfield had died, reached Miss Marple through the post. The symbolism was perhaps too obvious, new life growing from the site of tragedy. But she found it moving nonetheless. The pattern revealed. Setting aside her correspondence, Miss Marple took up her knitting, working on a particularly intricate pattern that required constant attention to prevent small errors from compounding into complete failure. The metaphor was not lost on her. Communities, like complex knitting projects, required vigilant care to prevent minor mistakes from destroying the entire enterprise. Little Wickham was learning this lesson the hard way, but it was learning nonetheless. She reflected that the secret folded inside the sewing basket had been far more than a simple family scandal. It had been a microcosm of the human condition itself, a reminder that beneath the placid surface of polite society, passions brewed, resentments festered, and the truth, when it finally emerged, often did so with brutal, life-altering force. Miss Cordelia had masterfully wielded her accumulated knowledge, creating a fragile ecosystem of dependence and obligation. When Agnes threatened to disrupt that system, it had fought back with lethal force, orchestrated by someone who understood its delicate balance all too well. People are very rarely wicked in the abstract, Miss Marple murmured to herself, watching the first snow of winter begin to fall outside her window. They are wicked out of love, or fear, or pride, or some desperate attempt to mend something that ought to have been faced squarely years before. Poor Mrs. Pemberton did a terrible thing, but she did not wake one morning and decide to become a murderess. She arrived there one small compromise at a time. The snow continued to fall, covering the familiar landscape with a blanket of deceptive purity. Miss Marple smiled at the sight, recognizing in it both the eternal human capacity for renewal and the dangerous human tendency to believe that covering something unpleasant would make it disappear entirely. There would, she knew, be other villages, other fates, other sewing baskets concealing their own folded secrets. And somewhere, someone would again believe that the only way to preserve what they loved was to do something unforgivable. When that time came, whether in the quiet lanes of another parish or in the drawing room of some distant country house, Miss Marple would be ready, knitting in hand, eyes apparently mild and wandering, mind attending to the eternal, intricate pattern of human nature, which, like her favorite lace designs, only revealed its true shape when viewed whole. As the church bell of St. Mary Mead rang the evening hour with calm regularity, Miss Marple counted the strokes and made a neat, invisible knot in her work. The secret folded inside the sewing basket had taught her, once again, that the most beautiful surfaces often concealed the most complex and troubling realities beneath, and that understanding this truth, however painful, remained humanity's best defense against repeating its most tragic patterns. The following spring brought to Little Wickham the sort of tentative renewal that follows profound trauma. Not the erasure of memory, but its gradual integration into the continuing fabric of community life. Miss Marple, observing from St. Mary Mead through correspondence and one final visit, witnessed the slow process by which a village learns to live with the full knowledge of what its members are capable of when pressed beyond their moral boundaries. The anniversary and aftermath. The first anniversary of Agnes Thornfield's murder passed with deliberate understatement. Rather than formal commemoration, Reverend Matthews organized a quiet, charitable drive for women's shelters, channeling the community's complex feelings into practical assistance for those trapped by circumstances beyond their control. The absence of ceremony was itself a form of remembrance, honoring Agnes not by dwelling on her death, but by embodying the transparency and moral courage she had sought to bring to Little Wickham. Miss Marple received detailed accounts from various correspondents. Dr. Marcus Finch, now the village herbalist, had found unexpected peace in his reduced circumstances. His small shop served the community with quiet dignity, his transformation from respected physician to humble tradesman representing a form of penance that seemed to bring him genuine healing. "I have learned," he wrote, "that redemption often requires accepting diminishment rather than fighting it." Mrs. Pemberton's institutional life had settled into routines that provided both structure and continuing struggle with conscience. Her letters revealed a woman still unable to write the word murder, referring instead to that day or the matter of the fate. Yet she prayed nightly for Agnes and the village. The beginning of something resembling penitence, or perhaps simply the persistence of deeply ingrained habit. Community transformation. Reverend Matthews had established what she called community conversations. Regular gatherings where residents addressed concerns before they festered into the sort of resentments that had proved so destructive. The radical transparency initially made some villagers uncomfortable, but they gradually discovered that openness reduced rather than bred the speculation and manipulation that had flourished under Miss Cordelia's system. The physical changes were equally significant. Thornfield Manor, now a National Trust property, had been quietly transformed. The sewing basket, after a brief display period, had been removed to private archives, its symbolic weight proving too heavy for casual tourist consumption. The rose garden, carefully tended by professional groundskeepers, had recovered its beauty while losing its associations with buried secrets. The wider legacy. The case had attracted attention from criminologists studying community psychology, resulting in academic papers analyzing how social pressure and moral compromise could transform respectable citizens into calculating criminals. More significantly, other villages dealing with similar situations had quietly instituted new governance procedures, learning from Little Wickham's painful experience without having to repeat it. Eleanor and Geoffrey Hartwell had found separate paths toward something resembling peace. Eleanor's work with elderly residents at a seaside care home had given her purpose, while Geoffrey managed National Trust properties, channeling his business acumen into preservation rather than acquisition. Neither spoke of their brief, tragic marriage, but both had transformed their shared catastrophe into quiet service to others. Miss Marple's final observations. During her last visit to Little Wickham, Miss Marple sat in the restored rose garden where Miss Cordelia had once tended both flowers and reputations. The climbing rose under which the documents had been buried showed new growth, though with a slightly strained quality, as if trying too hard to be what a rose ought to be. The most dangerous people, she reflected to Reverend Matthews, are often those who convince themselves they're protecting others. Mrs. Pemberton genuinely believed she was saving the village from scandal. Miss Cordelia probably convinced herself that her manipulations provided stability. The tragedy is that each might have been partially right, but the alternative, a community built on secrets and fear, proved even more destructive. The eternal pattern. Back in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, working on a shawl of such delicate complexity that its true pattern only emerged when viewed complete. She reflected that human nature was exactly like that. Individual actions, rarely understandable without whole context, individual lives, nearly meaningless without the pattern around them. The secret folded inside the sewing basket had been, ultimately, a metaphor for all hidden complexities of human relationships, how past actions continued influencing present choices, how individual decisions rippled outward to affect entire communities, and how truth, however painful, proved ultimately less destructive than the elaborate lies people constructed to avoid it. Somewhere ahead, she knew, lay another village fete, another apparently ordinary object concealing something folded, fragile, and dangerous within. When that time came, she would be ready to watch quietly from the corner, attending not to the spectacle but to those overlooked gestures and glances in which the true pattern of human nature invariably revealed itself. As the church bell of St. Mary Mead rang the evening hour, Miss Marple smiled at the sound. Unlike Little Wickham's bells, which had rung over so much concealed anguish, these marked time over a community that had learned to balance discretion with honesty, kindness with truth. It was the best one could hope for in this imperfect world, not the absence of secrets, but the wisdom to distinguish between those worth keeping and those too dangerous to bear. The pattern, she reflected, would continue, beautiful, terrible, and endlessly instructive in its complexity.